Good evening. I'm Yael Friedman, Director of International Programs at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I want to welcome you to the museum this evening. Esther Susán, to my left, a Museum of Jewish Heritage Prins Fellow, has organized tonight's program, a discussion of her research on Hungarian Jewish women with playwright Sarah Gancher, also to my left, and a reading of Five Mothers, a one-act play from 7th, presenting the stories of 5 generations of women in a Hungarian Jewish family. Esther and Sarah have been working together to create 7th, a theater project inspired by Budapest's 7th district, containing the historic Jewish quarter of Pest. The reading is directed by Joshua Kahan Brody. Esther is a doctoral candidate in education and Jewish studies at NYU, concentrating her studies on European Jewish built heritage, the politics of Holocaust memory in Central Europe, intergenerational Hungarian Jewish women's oral histories, and identification of the 3rd generation after the Holocaust. In Budapest, she created a Jewish grassroots nonprofit called Marom that connects Jewish revival and social justice activism and focuses on Jewish experiential education. Esther has been a fellow here since the fall. The presence of our Prins Fellows, who are scholars in residence, enables us to present programs like this one. The Prins Fellowship is made possible through a grant in honor of Branja Brandman, a survivor of Auschwitz and one of the museum's earliest and most steadfast volunteers. It is an opportunity in multidisciplinary fields to conduct research, engage in scholarly exchange, and to undertake professional development and training in the United States. Thank you again for joining us. Please join me in welcoming Esther and Sarah.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you for the nice introduction. And I'm so happy to see so many people come in this not so friendly weather. And so shortly about what's going to happen tonight is first we're going to have kind of free conversation with Sarah about my project and the 7th project that the play is part of, that you're going to hear after our conversation. So the conversation will be about half an hour. And then after that, we're going to invite the actresses on the stage. And there's going to be the reading. And after the reading, there will be a Q&A when you can ask questions either about the play or about my research or whatever comes up. So it's my honor to introduce Sarah Gancher, who is a long friend of mine and wonderful playwright. Sarah's plays have been seen at London's National Theatre, at the Edinburgh's Travers Theatre, the Public, New York Theatre Workshop, Steppenwolf, La Joya Playhouse, Seattle Rep, among others. She's a newly minted member of New Dramatists also. Sarah is the winner of the New York Stage and Film Funders Award, the Edgerton Foundation New Play Award, and the A.R. Gurney Prize. She's been a playwright in residence at Budapest Quarter 6, Quarter 7 Festival, which is organized by Marom in Hungary, in Budapest, including myself. And we presented her plays, which were part of the 7th cycle, just like Five Mothers, which you're gonna hear tonight. Last year, Sarah's musical, 100 Days, was seen at New York Theatre Workshop, and her musical, The Lucky Ones, was produced at Ars Nova. So, yeah.
And now we're going to talk, yeah. It was a lot of intro. I want to tell you guys a little bit first about how I met Esther, who's one of my closest friends and biggest inspirations. We met, I was living in Budapest for a couple of years. I had sort of gone there after a few years of working in New York and really burning the candle at both ends, and I was looking for a place to go and live very cheaply and try to do a lot of writing. And I sort of stumbled into meeting this group of friends that were young Jews that did not grow up with any kind of Jewish heritage, which is, or with any sense of a Jewish identity, really, which is not uncommon thing in Eastern European people that were raised in Eastern Europe. But they were all sort of feeling this urge to connect with their heritage and feeling, I feel really drawn to this, but I don't quite really know what it means or how I should relate to it. I don't know if I want to become religious. I don't know if I'm maybe just interested in Jewish music or in Jewish plays. And they had made this amazing place in the middle of the 7th District, the historic ghetto in Budapest. That was a squat, it was a on the ground, bottom floor, a theater and music venue, middle floor was a cafe during the day and a bar at night, and the top floor was a art gallery and an event space. There was amazing programming every night of the year, and to me I was like, I thought it was the coolest place in Budapest and probably the coolest place I had ever been. And I had not been especially used to thinking about Jewishness and coolness in the same breath in my head, and it was a really beautiful revelation. And so I started talking to Esther and her friends and asking them all about their lives and their family histories, and sort of trying to sort of understand a little bit about all the different things that Jewishness has been in this specific neighborhood in different times in history. The neighborhood of the 7th is a lot like the Lower East Side. It's a historically Jewish neighborhood that isn't really Jewish anymore. It's an immigrant neighborhood that's always been considered a Jewish neighborhood, even though it's always been very, very diverse. In Eastern European terms, that means like Serbians and Bulgarians and so forth. And it's a place where the revival and the gentrification of the neighborhood has been connected to a sort of a new interest in Jewish identity. So I was really interested in all of that and really interested in how the neighborhood had transformed as ideas about Jewishness had changed over history. What it means to be Jewish has meant many different things at many different times in Budapest. And it's the topic of the play, and it's also the topic of Esther's research. So we have both been involved in thinking about how these concepts of Jewishness change in each generation. And so I wanted to start, Esther, by asking you to talk a little bit about your research.
Sure. This was a great intro to that, because obviously I started my research by trying to make sense of my own experience growing up in Hungary, mostly post-socialist Hungary, even though I was 9 years old when the communist system was abolished, so I still had spent some time during that time. And so my research started with just trying to make sense of also my own activism within Marom, and the people around me, and how it was connected to the Jewish quarter, and if other peers of mine had the same experience. And then I moved to, the Jewish quarter, as Sarah was saying, was a very important part of it, but also social justice activism, which was kind of connected to the Jewish quarter, because at the time when we met, this neighborhood was, there were a lot of buildings torn down, and there was a movement of lawyers and activists, just like at the Lower East Side. I think there was a similar movement to protect the Jewish quarter, and so somehow there was this kind of sense that this is of not only my generation but the second generation. I'm in Hungary. I'm so-called member of third generation after the Holocaust. But this movement was more like led by second-generation Jews, because they were more like in a position of also like seeking legal solutions to how to prevent gentrification to happen. So, I mean, this kind of gentrification, these old buildings were about to be torn down. And this was about the time when in Marom we also realized that returning to religion, so if we started out organizing religious programs in the sense of like taking Jewish festivals and then giving them a completely new kind of setting in terms of, turning them into more like culture festivals or parties, but but keeping the idea of each Jewish holiday, the theme, the topic, and the main rites. But after we started this place, Marom also got broader in its mission, and we were more and more focusing on social justice also, because that we found was the least common denominator among young Jews, much more than maybe a smaller percentage was who really wanted to connect to actual religious activities, and a much broader amount of people wanted to connect to more loosely, culture activities or social justice activities. So
I want to hop in here for a second and say something about social justice and about the position of Jews in Hungary, because I think for me it was, even though I had always known, Jews sort of like as outsiders or as minorities in Europe, that was a thing I had intellectually known. It felt really different to be in a place where knowing that at various times Hungarianness has been defined in opposition to Jewishness, and other times that there's been seen to be no conflict between the two. My American linear history brain wanted it to be like, over time, more and more assimilated, right? Just like in America. But that wasn't the case at all in Hungary, I found. I found that in the 19th century, Jews had been much, much more integrated, and things had actually gone quite a bit backwards before traveling in a different direction with under communism. So I think that this thing of pushing for a more open and inclusive society within Hungary has a really, really tangible connection to Jewishness there, I would say, especially for young people who had the choice, had the luxury to decide whether or not they were interested in connecting to their Jewishness, I mean, you can think about it as a luxury, or you can think about it as actually a huge lack, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think that's true, and also because most Jews today in Hungary are in Budapest, and they come from middle-class families or middle-class, upper-middle-class. As we said, they have grown up mostly with not so traditional families, because those who were more traditional left in '56, and they were more like in the countryside. And still they have the heritage of, also the Holocaust, but also there were a lot of Jewish families, their parents and grandparents, but more like their parents, they were part of the dissident movement. So I think that there is that kind of commitment to a democratic society, which unfortunately today we are seeing to crumble. And we're gonna maybe talk about that. So yeah, so that was my first part of my research, and then I moved a little bit forward, you could say, and I started to be interested in this my parents' generation, basically. So or the dialogue between the generations, and I made a pilot research with 4 families where I could talk to the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter, and that was 12 interviews I made last summer, and they were live path interviews, which means that I asked the participants, the interviewees, to tell me their lives, mostly from the perspective of their Jewish journey. And I also asked a few questions, and and that research is what.
And I'm really excited for you to translate all of this into English so that I can read it and fully understand it. Because as you've been telling me, there's been some really amazing stories coming out of this. Would you mind telling this story about the woman with the singing contest?
Yes. Yeah, sure. Now or
now?
Yeah. Okay, good. So one of maybe the first interview was with her. So a major finding for me, or a major discovery or surprise after I made these interviews, was how little I knew about the communist period myself. And then I also went, I researched what's written about it, and there was very little written about it. And I found that in the general public memory about communism was very different from what I heard from the women. And also, I encountered stories that were silenced, some of them by themselves. So this was this singer's story, for instance, who is a famous singer in Hungary. She did not consent to be named in the research, so I can't tell her name, but you know, if you would be Hungarian, you would know her, and there is a very famous song that she sings, and she, her story was that she joined a kind of underground Zionist youth group, and not much after, so she won like a national contest, the third place.
Is this like a televised, like American Idol type of situation?
Exactly, and
but not American.
Communism, yeah. So in the 60s, and then this group was discovered by some secret service. One of them was a spy, apparently, and the rabbi he was not a rabbi yet, he was a rabbinical student who facilitated this group, was sentenced to 18 months of prison. And her career, which was just started to be going upward, was completely broken. And then later she left Hungary. She lived in Canada, but then later she moved back. So that was really shocking story for me, because I grew up with a family where in my family there was like communism was more understood in, you know, like that was the system and the Soviet army who saved the Jews from the Holocaust, and that during communism, yes, maybe there was less possibility to be Jewish, but there was some kind of solidarity within society. So I never encountered such like a really strong story of how you know, communism affected the Jews' lives. And the interesting thing about it was that part of her story was that a lot of Jews worked in the television and radio, and that they were afraid of calling her and giving her job because she was known to be Jewish. So basically they didn't want to you know, make themselves uncomfortable. So it was kind of an anti-Semitism that she experienced by Jews in part. So so that was a really a shocking story, and also it was kind of, you know, it was strange to me that she still does not want to give her name to this story to be public, and I think it tells a lot about how this era is really just now being started to be processed. So.
Were there other stories from your work that you thought could be, or other sort of patterns that you found, or anything else that you can tell us about the experience of doing these multi-generational interviews?
Yeah. So there is one story which I might save up for after the discussion, because it has a similar story in your play about a wedding that was not wanted by the mother of the person. So on, there is two levels. There is the horizontal level. So what I found as similarities among the same generation, more or less, and there is the vertical level, which is in between generations.
You mean like grandmother to mother to daughter?
Yes, thank you. So so from vertically, if you look like the transgenerational dialogue, I found that the political and historical milieu was probably more defining than the actual individual stories, and this is of course because we are talking about an era where we had the Holocaust and we had the communism and then we had the post-socialist time. So that's very clearly a main theme there.
Is just how much people are shaped by the times in which they live, you mean?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So I didn't necessarily find, other patterns. There were interesting things, though. For instance, let's call her Judith. I call her Judith in my research, this singer. So she, for instance, she was the one who said that what she passed down to her daughters was to rebel. And I found that really interesting, and that her rebel was also to leave Hungary at some point. But first, her rebellion was to join this Zionist movement, and she didn't necessarily join it because she was so Zionist, but she was against the system. So she felt like that's the way to express it. Yeah, of course, there was also, I think, that her father was a Holocaust survivor, and that it was kind of a counter-reaction to not being passive when you feel like you're pressed. Yeah, and then horizontally, I would say that I was finding more interesting or surprising things, especially in the second generation. So in the first generation, the generation who was Holocaust survivors, in terms of Jewish identity, I found they did not necessarily change. So they all came from like secularizing families, social democrat, communist, or just liberal or like middle class bourgeois families, and they remained so. So they didn't change in their Jewish identity as they told me their stories. In the second generation, though, I was surprised to find that that there was some kind of a revival. Maybe the revival is not the right word, because it started already in the 60s, like Judith's stories, but I did not expect that. I did not expect to find that, because normally or generally revival is associated with the post-socialist times, but in like 3 of the 4 of my interviewees, they sought connection already in the 70s. They went to the rabbinical seminary. There was a charismatic rabbi, Mr. Sándor Scheiber, who did Kiddush events, and then young people were meeting there, and after that in restaurants and bars and people's places. And 3 of the 4 participated there at the rabbinical seminary in some sense. And one of them made Aliyah to Israel. So, but at the same time, I got to the interviewees through, a snowball method. So meaning that through my acquaintances, my mother, my own. So it could also be that, this is not necessarily representative, but still, I think this was something very exciting for me, because we normally think, okay, during communism, there was no way to be Jewish, and that this generation was kind of like just also like
so it's like a sort of a secret Jewish rebellion, kind of like underground reconnection with Jewishness, right?
Exactly.
And Jewishness is a form of resistance.
Exactly.
In some way.
And then the 4th one, she also reconnected with Jewishness, but after the changes, and her story is interesting also because she was more like this other type of intellectual leftist, like part of the Hungarian New Left, but she also reconnected with Jewishness after the war. The changes.
I'm also really surprised to hear about this particular finding, because in my form of research, my writing research for things, particularly for this play, started so much with talking to people my age and asking them, what was your parents, what did you get from your parents? Did you know your grandparents? What do you remember from your grandparents? And so many of the people that I met of my generation said, yeah, my mother, my father, they were like, we're not Jewish, that I didn't even know I was Jewish. So many of them it was a secret that they had to figure out for themselves, or that they found out by accident. So it's really interesting to me to hear this part of it. A thing that that in Five Mothers that we're going to hear tonight, and it was the first play out of the seventh project. Oh, I think I maybe should say something. Okay, so Esther has very deeply been my partner on creating this overall theatrical project, Seventh, which is it's 7 theatrical projects about the 7th district, focused on how Jewishness has meant different things at different times, and how the neighborhood of the 7th changed as in tandem with the definition of Hungarian Jewishness. So there's a play that is all about sort of the historical relationship between Jewishness and communism. There's a play that's about Esther's friends building this this amazing squat. There's a play about the revival of anti-Semitism in the current day in Hungary. And this play was the first that I wrote. It's a little one act that's about the way that each generation finds their own definition of Jewishness. The thing that I found while I was, trying to write it was that the pattern that I observed was that there was this pendulum effect between religiousness and secularism, and then it would swing back over again to religiousness in the culture at large. Like I couldn't speak to like individual families, like what you're talking about. And it's really interesting to me to hear that you did and did not find that in your own work.
Yeah, exactly. I did not. So mostly in the first generation, they were already secularizing. In the second, of course, they had much less opportunity and connection, but there was some kind of a revival. And in the third, where you would think it was a revival, it was also not so clear because still it's not so straightforward that, if you're young, as you just described in the beginning, what does it mean to me if I can connect to, is it a culture, is it a gallery, a Jewish gallery that I really want to connect, is it a minyan? So yes, I did and did not find that, they weren't kind of opposing, like they didn't tell me the story of their Jewish identity in the sense that they would want it to oppose their parents' generation. Right. But that's an interesting question also.
Yeah. I mean, it'll be really interesting when you're able to do a lot of interviews and sort of like look at a bigger sample size, and you're going to find, I think, some really interesting stuff, and I kind of can't wait. Yeah. There are. Yeah. So now I'm just focusing on the second generation, and there is an archive of 120 interviews, more or less, that were made earlier, like 20 years ago. But I want to stress that this type of research is also not aimed at generalization. So, yes. And I think this is the connection between you as an artist or a writer looking at people's stories and trying to make sense of the world through their stories or tell the audience. And I think this is a similar thing that I'm trying to do in my research. And I also want to stress that, when I make interviews, it's just, part of the research is making the interviews. It's like, I don't know if you know action research, but like research has so many levels. And just talking to these women and listen to their stories was incredible. And I do think that, whenever you do that, whenever you listen to the story of someone, you become part of their story, you become part of their life, and they become part of your lives, and you're gonna alter that reality in some sense. So I like to think about my research in that sense. And, I mean, it's very meaningful for me to be able to do specifically this storytelling play here, because your stories and the stories that you've told me from your family are all over this play and all over the plays from the 7th. I've really just like looted your family history, but in the best way. And then I should say that like the collaboration has started there and then has gone to Esther, helping to get these plays translated into Hungarian and presented in Hungary, and facilitating this whole sort of back and forth conversation in a way that's been very beautiful. Before we do the play, would you tell just a little bit about your current research at the museum, your fellowship research?
Yeah, sure. So in the museum, I'm working with the educational department, and I do public lectures to the members. We did a book presentation, this event, and I hope that I'm going to be able to do further research as well. And we are now very soon going to open our new exhibition, which you probably have seen the signs of, Auschwitz, and I hope that I can be leading tours there. So my work at the museum is really with the educational department and public programming. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm really grateful to be able to be here and do my research.